Hello and welcome to Culture Reset Podcast. I'm Juliet Kamar and I'm usually joined by my co-host Caroline Kenlin, but Caroline is leaving me to it today, so I'm flying solo. Wish me luck. I'm pleased to say that my guest has such a lot of wisdom to share and great stories to tell, so I don't think I'll need any luck. She is Sarah Clein, an executive coach who, in her own words, helps knackered public sector women create enough midlife mojo to lead better or leave well. What a fabulous description. Welcome, Sarah.
Thank you, Juliet. Nice to be here.
Was that you, Sarah? Were you a knackered public sector woman?
I was. I started in the public sector in my early 20s, and by the time I got to my early 40s, so 20 odd years later, I was absolutely wrecked, to be honest. I was in that stage of life where I had really young kids. I was in a marriage that was failing, but I didn't realise that at the time. I was just working really hard at it. I had a big job. My mum had been ill for a while, so I just felt very squashed and squeezed between lots of responsibilities.
And was there a particular pinch point when you decided something had to give and you left your NHS job?
So the part of the NHS that I had been working in had moved into local government. And as part of one of the sets of reforms that had happened. And it was a really good opportunity. I'd just come back from maternity leave, having had my second child. And it was a really good opportunity to get used to a new organisation and work out how it ticked, really. And I carried on in this organisation with the job that I'd come across with and eventually got promoted into a new job. And a little while into this job, it was actually a secondment. I went to a conference and it was a work conference. And it was one of those events where we had a speaker. And the speaker sort of bounced down the middle aisle to get to the front row where all the male leaders of the organisation were sat. And he started fist bumping the male leaders on this front row. And I just looked at him and I just thought, I just can't do this anymore, because it may sound silly, but it was sort of symptomatic of a much bigger issue about the culture of that organisation. And I realised probably in that split second that I wasn't sure how I could lead with any integrity in an organisation which behaved like that. It wasn't just about the fist bumping, it was about what it represented.
Mm-hmm. And how did that make you feel?
Well, I felt very conflicted because I had a big job that had lots of potential scope and lots of interesting things to do, and I worked with some really great people, but to feel that I couldn't lead with any integrity. And what I mean by that was the politics of the organisation was such that they were very difficult to navigate, and it took a lot of bandwidth and energy, particularly given what I've said about the squeeze of life at midlife at that point. It took a lot of energy to keep on navigating these politics. And I just realised in that split second that I couldn't be the type of leader that I wanted to be. I couldn't lead with any integrity, and I couldn't work with a team if I didn't believe in the ethos of the organisation. It just didn't feel right.
I can understand that, yeah. So you deliberately focus on women. Why is that? Don't men also get knackered with all the pressures they come under?
They do, and I focus on women in terms of how I position and market the work that I do. And I think that the issues that face women, particularly at midlife, are particular to women. And I think there is a gender specificity to that. And what I mean by that is women are often, not always, but often the ones, if they're in a family setup and choose to have children, they are often the ones that take the I was going to say burden, which is completely the wrong word. They have the joy of managing a lot of the child stuff. So whether that be getting the child or children to school, managing all the things that go alongside that, they often do a disproportionate amount of work when it comes to having children. They often do a disproportionate amount of work in the home as well, in terms of managing what it takes to run a house. And so they are also doing those things while maybe navigating their way through a workplace. And research shows that lots of women start to fall out of the workplace at various pinch points in their life. So whether it be maybe coming back from maternity leave, whether it may be having another child, not just women that have children, but there's various pinch points in a woman's career when it just becomes more difficult to progress. So I find women when they get to midlife, if they are in big jobs, which tend to be the type of women I work with, they have it sounds like a real cliche to say they've fought their way through a glass ceiling, but they've got through a lot to get to that point. So sometimes I do work with men. I've also worked with people who identify as transgender, but I generally work with women because I think there are some specific issues that impact on women at midlife, which is the areas that I'm experienced in.
So I can relate that as well. We take on the lion's share. We tend to take on the lion's share of the household duties, the caring duties. That's a real, maybe a cultural or a traditional thing. What did you think that's fair to say?
I think it's interesting actually, because if I think back to when I had my children, for example, I had a group of people that were pregnant at the same time that I've stayed friends with. But what I remember when we'd had our children was they tended to do the work. And if I might say, well, can your partner not do that? I'd say, oh, no, he can't do that. He wouldn't be able to do that as well as I can. He can't cook like I can, or he can't do whatever. And it was always curious to me because my husband at the time and I made a decision that we'd split looking after the child, then children. So we both worked part-time and one of us went to work, the other one looked after the children. So we never really had that idea that it was only one of us that could do these things or one of us could do them better. So there are times when I think women possibly don't help themselves by thinking, well, I'm the only one who can change a nappy or cook the tea or dress a child, for example. But I also think that I remember, for example, my ex-husband going shopping with the kids one day and women coming up to him where we lived in Shropshire saying, oh, gosh, aren't you marvellous? Because he literally had 2 kids with him. Oh, marvellous. You're doing such a marvellous job. Where is them? Where's mummy? I mean, it's a while ago now. We're talking 15 years ago. So it's probable that wouldn't happen now. But I think there's something about the way society operates at times that women feel like they have to take on the lion's share, but they're almost conditioned to do that as well.
Yeah, and you don't see people going up to women in the street saying, isn't that marvellous, you're looking after your child?
Not really, no. And it was a bit staggering, to be honest with you, that happened.
And it must be, for women and families where you've got 2 high achieving or, senior leaders in the public sector or in any sector really who have a family as well. So there is there must be pressure on both of them to keep on top of everything that needs to be done.
Yes, and I think it's really, really challenging. And I suppose it depends maybe what sort of support setup you've got. Some of the people that I've worked with, for example, have had family around them that's been able to support them. That's something that I've never had. So we really, I suppose, made a decision very early on that we were going to look after the children ourselves. And not because we didn't have the option to involve other people, and they went to nursery at age 3 for a little bit of the week, but we had the types of jobs where we could work part-time, and I realised that that's a real, I was going to say luxury, it does feel like a luxury. We felt lucky, I suppose, to have the types of jobs where we could negotiate working part-time on the basis that if we wanted to work full-time in the future, there may be a potential to do that. But what was interesting when my husband was negotiating his side of it, he wasn't working in the public sector. It was more of a sort of company he was working with. And they basically said, well, if you do that, you'll never get to board. Is that okay? Are you realising what you're giving up in order to do this? And they put quite a lot of pressure on him.
I can really relate. Again, I keep saying I can relate. I think I was a knackered public sector woman when I left, by the time I left, because my husband is a consultant. I was working in the NHS in quite a senior leadership position, and things just come to a head, don't they, at some point, particularly, he worked silly hours, so that balance, and we didn't have family around, which is where you start building up your own support networks, don't you? Friends, nurseries, after school clubs, it's a real tentative, finely balanced, finely tuned engine that you end up building. And if one thing knocks off, it can really knock off the whole system that you've built to support your family. Yeah,
and I think, I guess you maybe relate to this, but that thing about, I remember a slightly older colleague of mine saying to me, just make sure that you remember when your first child goes to secondary school, just be aware that that's a real pinch point. So I suppose that's the other thing that I've become conscious of. My children are now teenagers. They will be 15 and 17 shortly. So I think of the pinch points of when they started school. That's such a big transition. And, you know, sports days and nativity plays and all the stuff that comes from school, like a bombardment continually of this day and this book club and all the things you need. And then they have school holidays, and then they start secondary, and we've just gone through GCSEs. So there seems like there's lots of pinch points along the way that, as you say, if your systems aren't rock solid, or the slightest thing can just shift them off balance. And when you're also managing a big job in, let's face it, the public sector is very volatile, very complex, very uncertain. It's a lot for people to manage.
Yeah. So is there anything else that you think plays in, particularly for women, at this stage in their lives?
I think the biggest thing that I actually haven't mentioned yet is perimenopause. And in fact, for me, I didn't mention before that when I decided to leave, that was the other thing that was going on for me. I didn't actually realise at the time I was perimenopausal. I thought I was just going mad. And what I mean by that is I would sit in rooms, meeting rooms, and just want to leave, you know, and that wouldn't have been acceptable in the context that I was in. I'd became really anxious about driving. Just things that would have just taken in my stride previously just became big things. And I think it's interesting when I talk to women now about their own menopause journey and work and family and people talk about the fact that they no longer trust their mind and body to do what it used to do. They can't guarantee that they'll wake up and sort of not have a random bit hurting or not have forgotten something or not feel anxious. So I think it's a real time for women of real shift in terms of their physical and psychological state. And that can take a number of years for people to come to terms with and understand what's happening, maybe put some support in for themselves. But it's a massive life-shifting thing going through menopause.
Absolutely. And in terms of organisations and culture, would you say the public sector is supportive of women who are... I know that's a big question, but in your experience...
I think it's getting better in terms of the things that you would routinely expect now to see in organisations. But the women that I work with, what I find is that doesn't make it easier necessarily to talk about the fact that they are menopausal, that they might have brain fog, or they might be feeling, you know, they might have flushes or whatever it might be. I think for lots of women that I work with, there's still a sense of putting my armour on when I go to work, because they might not want to talk about, particularly in organisations that are maybe from a leadership point of view quite male dominated, they might not want to talk about menopause to the people around them. And I think that it also presumes that women understand what's going on for them well enough to have sort of absorbed it and processed it and then be able to just be out loud about it. And that also isn't the case as well. It's often... menopause is one of those joyous things that, I'm not saying it changes every day, but it brings new and surprising things week on week for some women. So I'd say organisations are definitely better, but I still think for lots of women it's a massive challenge to talk about it.
For me, it was anxiety. I felt going into meetings that I previously would walk into without any issues.
Yeah.
I just had this rising anxiety that was... surprising and not me. I just didn't feel like me until I got on top. And like you, I didn't know what it was, and I didn't know how to ask for help. Yeah.
No, and it's incredibly destabilising. And I think, particularly for women who are maybe in the biggest job in their careers, the other thing that I hear a lot from, not more and more because it's always been there, but it's not just about having the skills to do your job at that level. It's also about having the skills to navigate the office politics. And you're nodding because I know you know it, and you know I know, and it's almost an obvious thing to say, but it's as much about being able to manage the office politics and manage your position in the organisation. And I work with some people who are maybe newer in the director space, let's say, and I think they find it a bit of a surprise that actually it isn't just enough to be good at your job. You have to be good at managing your colleagues and second guessing what people are doing and, you know, navigating what can be quite backstabby places sometimes and backstabby situations. So it's a lot if you're not feeling physically either on top of your game or although as though you can trust your body and mind to do what it did yesterday or the day before.
Yeah, absolutely. So what would you say to women who are struggling like you were? What advice would you give them?
I mean, I would say, certainly compared to how I was, so I'm talking now, it was 10 years ago now that I left and set up my company and sort of realised I didn't want to work in that way or place any longer. I would say now there's more support. So I would say, obviously you can look online and get information. Lots of organisations now have menopause cafes, menopause groups, obviously menopause policies and things like that. I would, if you're struggling and just cannot seem to find a way out of it, obviously talk to your GP and see what sort of support there might be from a medical point of view. But I think that's only one aspect. I think there's other things that you maybe need to think about, am I saying yes to things? Is it a hell yes, I really want to do this? Or is it a bit of a resigned, I feel like I should? You know, where are your boundaries? In terms of your working day, as an example, especially since we've had COVID, that hybrid working, I hear more and more people say, well, I just log on at 7 now because I'm just at home, so I may as well. Now, I recognise not everyone works from home. I just log on earlier because I just want to clear my emails, adjust. And then I sort of log off about 6. I just go back on just to clear my emails in the evening. And that word just that I keep repeating is a very deliberate and intentional repetition, because I hear more and more people expanding their working days. I don't go to the gym anymore because I just don't have time. I'll see my mum. I used to see her on a Friday. I'll see her in a couple of weeks, and so on and so forth. People, the work will expand to the space that you allow it to fill. So there's something about recognising the cavalry is not coming. You really do need to put your own boundaries in place. I've talked about the GP before. Medical help can be part of it, HRT, etc. But also think about, how are you supporting yourself? What's your health scaffolding, food-wise, movement-wise, hydration-wise, sleep-wise?
A real holistic look at
Yes.
your life and what you're doing. A life audit almost,
Yes.
and work audit.
Yeah.
I can see how I kind of fell into some of that, because I used to work 4 days a week and Friday would be my day off. But I used Friday mornings just to clear the stuff that I hadn't got on top of the previous 4 days. So yeah, it eats into your own time, doesn't it?
I hear that so much, and what I also hear now is it stretches. So people say, well, I'll just log on a Saturday because it's really great because there's no one emailing me and I can just clear. I take my laptop on holiday just to make sure that I pick up any emails, and it's like, no, because what you're doing is constantly being on alert and you're constantly scanning your environment. And it's no wonder then that people end up some way down the line headed towards burnout, anxiety over and above the normal, I say normal, not everyone experiences, but the hormonal sort of anxiety that is associated with menopause, are absolutely knackered. And that's, as I say, on top of often a lot of big life stuff that people are doing as well. So let's face it, your organisations are not going to say, oh gosh, you do seem to be answering a lot of emails. You seem to be going to a lot of meetings. Even the best organisations will step over your knackered body on the way out. They're just there to get the job done. Even the best caring organisations, they ain't going to say to you, you need to stop now. You have to do it for yourself.
Nobody's going to tap you on the shoulder and say, hey, you need to slow down.
No.
You need to be that person for yourself, don't you?
You need to be it for yourself. But if you're a leader in an organisation, you have a responsibility and a moral obligation to show other people what a healthy professional midlife looks like. Because I also hear lots of people say, well, I tell them to stop. I tell them to log off. But it's empty words if you're not doing it yourself. And I know how hard it is. I'm not trying to say that this is easy. So what I would say to people is, and what I do say to people is, start with something easy. Start with, I see my mate and I go to the gym on a Thursday at 6 o'clock, or I go to yoga at 5 o'clock on a Monday, or just something. So there's some end point that you can work towards.
Do you know what I've seen in the past is where I get an email from a senior leader and it says in their signature if you receive this email after 6 p.m, please know that I don't expect you to respond. But they're still sending it after 6 p.m.
And it's interesting, actually, because I was working with someone recently who has a manager with a similar sort of strapline. And what they were saying were that the words are, oh, no, don't expect you. But it feels like you're supposed to, because they are, and they take their laptop on holiday and they don't use their annual leave, all of it. And you just think, well, that's a message that you're giving out by your actions.
Those behaviours
Yes.
build the culture.
Absolutely.
And the culture is the least behaviour that we're willing to accept, the worst behaviour we're willing to accept. So if we're accepting those behaviours, it builds into that culture, doesn't it? The norms.
It does. And I think the word accepting is interesting, because I think we celebrate those behaviours at times as well. I think that presenteeism thing, I think the busy people get more work to do. I think we celebrate those people that seem to be, on a hamster wheel. And it was interesting, actually, because I was working with somebody recently who was feeling quite burnt out, quite knackered, etc., etc. And when we sort of dug into it, what became clear was that emergency response that people might give when someone's got a problem was that had become a little overdialed. It's a bit of a coaching term, that. But basically, they were giving their emergency response to everything. So what I mean by that is they answered every email like that, every person that rang, they were like that, every Teams message. They just literally were on red alert for everything, with no discernment between, actually, that person could probably sort that out for themselves. Actually, I'm not sure that is an emergency. Actually, I don't know why I'm answering that, and that's the other thing. People lose sight very quickly of, what am I actually here to do? And they end up doing all the things for all the people. And as I say, then on the road to exhaustion and burnout if they're not careful.
So they're in amygdala hijack permanently.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's really, really sad.
It is. And sorry, I was just going to say one more thing. One of the things that I say to people sometimes, and this is more part of the work I do, is leadership development training. And I say to people, if I remember, and if it's people of a certain age, they'll relate to this. Once upon a time, there was one computer in the office. I wasn't allowed to touch it. Obviously, the secretary could touch it, and that was it. And then we had a laptop, computers on our desks. And then eventually we got to the point of getting Blackberries. If you're a certain point in the organisation, you'd have a Blackberry. And how exciting it was then when that little red light was flashing, because that meant somebody needed you. Now, there is no cut-off, is there? You can be, emails. People say, if I pop to the loo in the night, I check my emails. I say, why? Why at 3 o'clock in the morning are you checking it and responding to emails? So the means are there to be on 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It's very different to how it used to be. When you shut the door to your office, you could pretty much guarantee that your work wouldn't be following you out the door. It follows you around the globe now, so you have to put your boundaries in place.
Absolutely. And it's that kind of, our brains are being rewired to respond to these immediate demands on us, which is, it's just not healthy, is it? Those small dopamine hits that we think we're getting from, responding, aren't going to sustain us, are they?
They're not, because they're shallow and empty. But I was laughing the other day about this, because I went to see a new dental hygienist, and she advised me to change my toothbrush from one electric one to another electric one. But the bonus of this one was it'd link with your phone, and I was like, oh yeah, link with your phone, that's great. And then I got it home and I thought, I don't want to link it with my phone, because I don't want to have another thing, another target to hit, about not so much how many seconds you spend on a quadrant. I'm over that now. It's more, what were the angles of the toothbrush, and did you hit each tooth in the amount of ways that you should have hit it, or whatever the phone was going to monitor via the toothbrush. I've no idea. I just thought, I'm not doing it. It's not another target to hit. I'm not gamifying brushing my teeth.
Yeah. Oh gosh, the world's gone mad. So yeah, if you're working with a woman who has a senior job, and they're got some of the issues that you've been describing, and they've been spending years or decades towards working their way up to the top, and they're feeling like you've been describing, what's your advice to them? Particularly if they're at a stage where they may be questioning, do I stay or do I go? What are the kind of things that they might say to you, and what would you say back to them?
So I do work with lots of women who are at that point, and the should I stay or should I go? There's a song about that, isn't there? Is often Should I look for another role in another organisation? Or should I, is it time now to do something else that is outside of these types of organisations? And sometimes people come to me whether in a pretty bad way. Maybe they've exited an organisation in a way that they haven't chosen to. And one of the things that I work with them to try and understand is that rucksack you've got on your back of all the stuff that you take from job to job, what of it actually belongs to you and is helpful and healthy for you, and what of it actually belongs to a culture or a place or a time that isn't really to do with you or isn't anything that's particularly helpful for you to carry on with. So there's something about helping people to understand, what are my values, what are my strengths, when am I at my best, what sort of day, week and month do I want, and then thinking about what sort of working environment is going to give me that, and how am I to respond to the working environment. So sometimes it's very simple things like people putting some boundaries around their working day. So they go for a walk before they go to work, they stop looking at their emails at 6 o'clock, they might take up that yoga habit, they might start that class that they want to do, they might do compressed hours. But it really does depend, excuse me, on what it is that they want to do differently in terms of if they're staying in the role that they've got, in the same role that they're in, how can they manage that differently so they don't get so burnt out and exhausted in that role? If they have exited an organisation perhaps in a way that wasn't of their choosing, what do they need to leave behind with that organisation because it doesn't belong to them, it belongs to time and place and people? What is it that they need to think about if they're looking for a new role? What are they taking into that role? What is their ideal organisation look like? What values are they looking for? What attitudes do they, behaviours, etc.? And then obviously if people are planning for a life outside of work, that's a different thing altogether.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So it's really kind of completely rethinking their relationship with the work that they're doing.
Often it is, and sometimes as well, it's about thinking about how they work with the people around them. A bit like I was saying before about people's emergency response. And one of the things that my friends, so I'm 53, nearly 53, so have a lot of friends around the same age and older, and people laugh now about not being quite as helpful as we once were. And I mean, there is a scientific reason as to why we're not from a sort of reduction of estrogen point of view, but generally just not quite as helpful as we were. And I think I often work with women who are realising that they've got themselves in this position where they're the font of all knowledge, the answer of all the questions, and et cetera, and they don't want to do that anymore. So there's something about redrawing who they are as a professional and what that means. And I see it particularly with NHS leaders, actually, who have maybe nurses, maybe who've worked the way up through the ranks, not just nurses, but who are at the point where they realise that they're being all the things for all the people in work, and they haven't got the bandwidth to do it anymore, and they don't want to do it anymore. They just don't want to be that as helpful as they once were, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. They don't want to be rescuing people in the way that they once were.
So they want to completely renegotiate their psychological contract with themselves and also with the people they're working with. Yeah,
they and not only do they want to do it, they need to do it. Because I think sometimes where you've had people maybe who've worked their way up in an organisation, it's very easy, like a snowball that gathers things as it rolls down a hill. You suddenly find that you're doing all those things you were doing, plus you've got this big job to manage. It's not sustainable, particularly when you add in, I might have an older parent that's struggling a little bit that I need to support, and I've got a teenage child that's going through GCSEs. I need to be there for them. I've got a big job I need to manage. Menopause, who knows what's going to happen tomorrow. You can see how the squeeze comes for midlife women.
Sometimes you just kind of stop and go, what the hell am I doing?
Yeah.
I remember my pinch point, I guess, was I remember coming home and opening my front door, and my kids and my husband, they all popped their heads through and they went, what's for tea? And I thought, how did I get myself into this situation where it's me, it's my responsibility, and I can't, and then that was my pinch point, and I sat down with my husband and I said, I can't do it. Why is it my responsibility? And I think I'd never found my voice, or never, well, you just, like you say, I'm in a snowball, things just,
yeah,
you're on a train and you don't get off it for a while because you're so busy you don't see it.
You don't see it. Yeah, you sort of almost, dear listener, with your hand at your nose right in front of your face going, holy moly, how have I suddenly got into that position?
Yeah.
But it's, my husband will come in the house and he'll say, does the dishwasher need emptying? Do I need to feed the cats? You know, and I'm answering the questions until I catch myself and say, well, in the nicest possible way, love, you could probably see if the cats need feeding.
Yeah.
But you know, and the dishwasher, you could just open the door and see. But I think sometimes what I hear women say is they're just in a position where they answer all the questions at home, let's say. They're the manager of all the things at home. They're the finder of all the things at home. Now, I'm being a bit sweeping, not every woman and not every home. But that's something that women often seem to feel like they get into that position. And then they go to work. And I've not talked about office housework, but research shows that actually what happens for a lot of women at work is they end up being the ones that are asked to sort out the Christmas do, to bring in the cakes on a Friday, to make sure that person has a birthday card. So they're sort of expected to do it often, but they also often want to do that. They take on the emotional labour in an organisation.
Nurturing role.
All of that, yeah. And in the same way as they would do maybe that at home, you know, that one's fallen out with that one. I need to organise a play date for that one. I need a birthday present for that party. They keep all that stuff often in their heads for home. At work, they can often find they've taken a lot of the emotional labour of the workplace as well. And it's knackering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we need to finish soon. It's been a great conversation. Can we end with your top tip for listeners to take away? Is there someone listening who's in the same position as you were at that very challenging point in your career? What would you say to her?
So what I would say to her is just have a look at how you're managing your average day, or have a look at your average week, and have a look at what boundaries might have slipped a little bit. Have you started to say to yourself things like, I'm just going to log on a little bit early just to clear this before I start the working day? Have you started to say to yourself, I'll just work till 7 because actually that'll get the stuff done? Have you started to say to yourself, oh, I'm not going to see my friends this week now. I'll do that in a few weeks. My invitation to you is to just notice what are the things that are starting to become everyday habits that are now just who you are, that actually almost the things you swore you'd never be. You swore you'd never be that person who took their laptop on holiday. You swore you'd never be that person that ditched your mates because you had to work. I just invite you to just consider, are there things that are starting to creep in to be your norm that actually, as you take a step back, you were never going to be that person?
That's great. Thank you so much, Sarah Clein, a coach specialising in midlife mojo. And if you'd like to contact Sarah, there are links in the podcast notes. So that's it from me, Juliette Kumar. Until the next episode of Culture Reset. Goodbye.